Chapter 1 of George Washington. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. George Washington by Ferdinand Schmidt. Translated by George P. Upton. Boyhood. The contemplation of the wonders of the universe is always inspiring and uplifting. The crystalline purity of the sky, the splendor of the sunrise and sunset, the grandeur of the starry night, the fragrant forest, the smiling landscape, the tree, the flower, the boundless ocean, and all the countless manifestations of nature. But how much greater our admiration and inspiration when we reverently contemplate the progress of a noble human soul toward ever higher and higher planes of perfection. Some of the good seed which it scatters may take root in our minds to strengthen and develop the best that is in us. We perceive the possibilities of the race and what we may ourselves become if the will to strive keeps pace with a love for what is good. In ancient times, thoughtful people compared great and good souls to the stars. They rise in the spiritual firmament with a pure radiance, and ever anew breaking through the mists and clouds which obscure them, remain visible to later generations. Thus they become guiding stars for struggling human beings here below. The particular star which the reader has the wisdom and the inclination to perfect himself is invited to study in these pages arose in the forests of Virginia on the 22nd of February, 1732. It was there that little George first opened his eyes and looked out upon a world in which he was to play so great a part. There his negro mammy sat with him on the bench before the door, throwing crumbs to the turkeys and pigeons to amuse him, and there, under the rustling trees, he whittled his first horse out of hazelwood. George's father, Augustine Washington, was a planter of English extraction. His first ancestor had immigrated from England when North America was still the undisputed property of the Indians. The territory which later became the United States is almost as large as the continent of Europe. 200 years ago the whole country was a trackless forest, broken only by enormous morasses, canebrakes, and savannas or grassy prairies. In the properest plantation house on the east bank of the Rappahannock, in which George was born, piety, industry, and probity had made their habitation. That was the first blessing with which heaven dowered the boy. Of course, living in a pure and healthy moral atmosphere is not in itself all that is required to guide a youth into paths of rectitude. The will to do right and the continual struggle to attain it can alone accomplish the greater part. Reprobates have sometimes come out of the best environments. The voice of conscience is awakened very early in the human breast, and we soon know right from wrong. However, it is a great boon and a wonderful help to be surrounded by people who are examples of virtue in word and deed, and he who strays into the paths of sin, in spite of such surroundings, is doubly to be censured. At that time the English immigrants lived scattered in the forests, but neighbors had already formed themselves into parishes and founded schools and churches. The schools were, of course, of a very simple type, nothing but reading, writing, and arithmetic being taught. Most of the settlers found this quite sufficient for their children, and rich planters sent their sons to England to be educated. Lawrence Washington, George's eldest stepbrother, enjoyed these advantages. He was 14 years older than George, who was a babe in arms when Lawrence set out on his first voyage to England, so that he could not remember his stepbrother. When George was 8 years old, Lawrence, now in his 22nd year, returned. The arrival of the well-educated and well-bred young gentleman was a welcome event in the family circle, and George loved him from the very first moment. Their affection was mutual, and indeed Lawrence showed a truly paternal interest in the bright, alert boy. Their father had no intention of sending another son abroad. He looked upon Lawrence as the natural head of the family after his death, and was satisfied that his probable successor had received a liberal education. Accordingly, George was sent to the parish school. He applied himself eagerly to his task, and thus laid a firm foundation, at least for the studies which he afterward prosecuted by himself. One trait of his character showed itself very early. He did all his work with the greatest conscientiousness and neatness. Not a stroke of his pen betrayed carelessness. Some of his school books, which have been preserved, bear witness to this. He showed the same care when any work about the house was required of him. He endeavored to do whatever he had to do, however insignificant it was or might seem to be, as perfectly as possible. Of course, he was not capable of appreciating at that time how important this was in the development of his character. It was simply his early awakened sense of duty, reinforced by his earnest efforts to practice what he knew to be right. It was not until later that he realized the deeper significance of work as a means of strengthening the powers of the soul. There is no kind of work which may not be either well or ill done. If you put all your capabilities into it, and the result is more or less satisfactory, you have accomplished even more than the success of a moment. You have been working for the growth of your inner self. For one who realizes this, the greatest drudgery has lost its sting. George was just as conscientious in everything which pertained to morals. He had a passionate disposition, but we learn that early in life he strove to curb his hasty temper by exercising deliberation and will-power. It was therefore customary among his schoolfellows, when disagreements arose, to take them to him, and his verdict was generally accepted, for they knew that he was willing to acknowledge himself in the wrong when his fiery temper had carried him away. It was justice and not the person that had weight with him. Another of his qualities, military talent, was early recognizable. It was an inheritance. There had been warriors among his ancestors, men of note of whom English chronicles tell us. Several of these had so distinguished themselves as to have been knighted. George's brother Lawrence was of a like temper, and it now happened that he had an opportunity of becoming a soldier. British commerce in the West Indies had suffered heavy losses through piratical attacks by Spain, and the English government determined to avenge itself. A fleet was fitted out, and as England was the mother country of the Virginias, the recruiting drum was heard in the colony also. Lawrence volunteered and was given a captain's commission. It was no wonder that there was considerable excitement over all this in the home of the Washingtons. George took the liveliest interest in his brother's equipment. He thought it very proper that the robbers, of whom he had heard many dreadful stories, should be punished, and gazed at his brother's bright sword with delight and respect. He vowed that he too would sometime help to right the wrongs of his injured countrymen in time of need. He was told many tales of his valiant ancestors. It is no wonder that the picture of his brother as he had left home in his war trappings was constantly in his mind, nor that he begged for his letters, after his father had read them to the assembled family, to pore over them, especially when they had something to tell of the soldier's adventures. All these exciting experiences which filled his mind soon manifested themselves in his play. In place of ball and games of a like nature, war became the great game. His comrades were divided into companies. He sketched plans of battles which were carried out. He determined the arms they were to use and held reviews. It never occurred to any of his little comrades to dispute him the rank which he bestowed upon himself. These occupations were also, although neither he nor anyone else suspected it, more or less of a preparation for his after-life. Just as he had before this been the legislator for his little circle, he was now the military chieftain. But even when playing at soldier, the peculiarity of his character, which led him to carry out everything he undertook with the greatest thoroughness, was apparent. He knew what accomplishments a soldier must strive to acquire, and now we see him practicing these exercises with unflagging zeal, with the object of making his body strong and supple, such as running, leaping, wrestling, tossing bars, and the like. the leader of the little band, strove to be, in reality, the first and foremost, and wished to live up to his title. After taking part in the siege of Cartagena in the West Indies, Lawrence returned home. One can imagine with what interest George listened to his brother's recitals. What Lawrence learned of George's military exercises and play confirmed in him a plan which he had long ago formed, and which had George's hearty approval. He proposed to his parents that as soon as George should have reached his 14th year, the boy should be allowed to enter the English service as a naval cadet, and the carrying out of the plan was actually considered. Lawrence himself intended to return to his regiment to seek advancement in the army, but never did so. Instead, he fell in love with the daughter of a rich planter, William Fairfax. His advances were accepted, and an engagement took place. His father was very much pleased to have his son enter into an alliance with the rich and highly esteemed house of Fairfax, but was not fortunate enough to live to see the wedding. George was 11 years old when he stood at the grave of his excellent father. The deceased left considerable property, so that his children from both marriages were well provided for. Lawrence received an estate on the banks of the Potomac, where he took his young bride a few months later. According to the terms of the will, no guardian was appointed for the younger children, but they were left in charge of their mother, a proof of the confidence that deceased had reposed in her. She was worthy of it. Irving says of her, she was endowed with plain, direct good sense, thorough conscientiousness, and prompt decision. She governed her family strictly but kindly, exacting deference while she inspired affection. She was Washington's second wife, and George, her firstborn, was her favorite. In spite of this, or rather because of it, she was very strict with him, where she deemed it necessary to protect him from excesses, and her faithful care was rewarded. At that time, Sir Matthew Hale's Contemplations, Moral and Divine, was held in great esteem among the educated English colonists of Virginia. It was the mother's favorite book, from which she not only drew strength and consolation for herself, but from which she also read aloud to her children. Her friends often found her thus occupied. She not only showed great insight in the selections which she made, but the deep spiritual feeling with which she read aloud from this, and sometimes from other writings, made a deep impression on her young hearers. Her enthusiasm was communicated to her children, and as the whole life and doings of the household were pervaded by a spirit of moral earnestness, these impressions received by the young minds were not easily effaced, but rather were confirmed. The copy of the above-mentioned work, in which the name of Mary W. is written by his mother's own hand, remained a valuable memento in George's possession all his life, and he often declared that the precepts which it contained, expounded by the soulful voice of the mother, striving for the improvement of her children, had had a decisive influence on his whole life. The book is still preserved in the archives of Mount Vernon. George continued his school and home studies with unabated industry. It was not necessary to urge him on, but rather to warn him not to go too far in his zeal. He was filled with an ardent desire to acquire fresh insight, knowledge, and skill in something each day of his life. It was a true thirst for knowledge. Somewhat farther away than his first teacher, Hobby, lived another named Williams, who widened the horizon of his schooling a little, and to whom he now went to learn something of commercial bookkeeping. Although it was a dry subject, George made astonishingly rapid progress, inspired by the determination to acquire it as quickly as possible. In the realms of knowledge and skill he played the role of conqueror. Mind, will, and memory were his weapons, which became sharper and more highly polished the more he used them. Careless and lazy school comrades appeared contemptible creatures to him. At this time he collected examples of all kinds of documents used in business and daily affairs. One of his collection bears the title Written Extracts, and we find among them prescriptions, checks, receipts, affidavits, forms of resignation, titles to property, leases, contracts, and wills. All these were copied with great care, the important words written in larger letters, so that they were easily to be distinguished. George had also made great progress in athletic attainments. He had been diligently practicing the exercises of which we have spoken ever since it had been decided to let him enter the English service as a naval cadet. He considered it a matter of course that a future soldier must employ himself systematically in strengthening his muscles and acquiring the greatest possible dexterity. The places still shown in the neighborhood of his father's property where George threw a stone across the Rappahannock. He was also a fine horseman. On one occasion he mounted an unmanageable horse, to the astonishment of all onlookers, and was able to control it. In the meanwhile, Lawrence had taken the necessary steps for his brother's entrance into the English navy. A midshipman's warrant was obtained, and his luggage was packed. But at the last moment his mother, after carefully reconsidering the matter, resolved not to let her son go out into the world so early. It was not a mother's weakness that led her to this determination. She had heard so much about the roughness of a seaman's life, it is scarcely to be wondered at she recoiled from a plan which meant removing her son completely from his mother's influence, and cut him off from the help and advice of his relatives. His love and the respect which he had for her opinions helped to soften the disappointment. Later he was able to thank her for having, at that time especially, taken his destiny under such careful and earnest consideration. Before we follow his life history any further, let us notice a practice of his in early life. He kept a diary in which he noted everything that aroused his interest. Besides this, he recorded significant ideas or thoughts which he found in books or heard from the lips of wise or experienced persons. It would be a very good thing for our young readers to follow his example in this. A portion of his diary bears the superscription "Rules for Behavior in Company and Conversation." Among them are some important truths and some of lesser significance. A number of extracts are given as they characterize George's aspirations so well, and also in the hope that some readers may make a selection from among them, and, this is only a suggestion, with it begin a diary of their own. Here are a few examples. Every action in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those present. In the presence of others, sing not to yourself with a humming noise, nor drum with your fingers or feet. Speak not when others speak. Sit not when others stand, and walk not when others stop. Turn not your back to others, especially in speaking. Jog not the desk or table on which another reads or writes. Lean not on anyone. They that are in dignity or office have in all places precedence, but whilst they are young they ought to respect those who are their equals in birth and other qualities, though they have no public charge. It is good manners to prefer those to whom we speak before ourselves, especially if they be above us, with whom in no sort we ought to begin. Let your discourse with men of business be short and comprehensive. In visiting the sick, do not presently play the physician, if you be not knowing therein. Undertake not to teach your equal in the art he himself professes. It savors of arrogancy. Being to advise or reprehend oneself, consider whether it ought to be in public or in private, presently or at some other time, also in what terms to do it. And in reproving, show no signs of choler, but do it with sweetness and mildness. Mock not, nor jest at anything of importance. Break no jests that are sharp or biting, and if you deliver anything witty or pleasant, abstain from laughing thereat yourself. Wherein you reprove another, be unblameable yourself, for example is more prevalent than precept. Use no reproachful language against anyone, neither curses nor revilings. Be not hasty to believe flying reports to the disparagement of anyone. In your apparel be modest, and endeavor to accommodate nature rather than procure admiration. Keep to the fashion of your equals, such as are civil and orderly, with respect to time and place. Associate yourself with men of good quality if you esteem your own reputation, for it is better to be alone than in bad company. Let your conversation be without malice or envy, for it is a sign of tractable and commendable nature, and in all causes of passion admit reason to govern. Be not forward, but friendly and courteous, the first to salute, hear, and answer, and be not pensive when it is a time to converse. If two contend together, take not the part of either unconstrained, and be not obstinate in your opinion. In things indifferent, be of the major side. Reprehend not the imperfections of others, for that belongs to parents, masters, and superiors. Think before you speak. Pronounce not imperfectly, nor bring out your words too hastily, but orderly and distinctly. When another speaks, be attentive yourself, and disturb not the audience. If any hesitate in his words, help him not, nor prompt him without being desired. Interrupt him not, nor answer him till his speech be ended. Be not apt to relate news, if you know not the truth thereof. When you deliver a matter, do it without passion and indiscretion. However mean the person may be, you do it to. When your superiors talk to anybody, hear them, neither speak nor laugh. Be not tedious in discourse, make not digressions, nor repeat often the same matter of discourse. Be not angry at table, whatever happens, and if you have reason to be so, show it not. Put on a cheerful countenance, especially if there be strangers, for good humor makes one dish a feast. When you speak of God or his attributes, let it be seriously, in reverence and honor, and obey your natural parents. Let your recreation be manful, not sinful. Labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience.
Chapter 2 of George Washington. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrea Kotzer. George Washington by Ferdinand Schmidt. Translated by George P. Upton. The Surveyor. After the plan of allowing him to enter the English service as a naval cadet had been abandoned, George continued his attendance at school with the intention of preparing himself to become a surveyor. Until the completion of his 15th year, he applied himself to these studies, principally geometry and trigonometry. During his last summer at school, he made surveys of the fields and meadows belonging to the schoolhouse, and also of the neighboring plantations. This business, which was only practice for him, he carried on as conscientiously as though he were obliged to take an oath as to its accuracy. Every detail pertaining to it, such as drawings, calculations, and references, were carefully put on paper. There was not an inserted word nor a blot to be seen. If he did make a mistake, he would erase it so cleverly that it could be discovered only on the closest inspection. One could see that it was a law of his being to do everything with the greatest neatness. But he was just as particular with regard to order and oversight. Irving says of him, "Nothing was left half done or done in a hurried and slovenly manner." The habit of mind thus cultivated continued throughout life, so that, however complicated his tasks and overwhelming his cares, in the arduous and hazardous situations in which he was often placed, he found time to do everything and to do it well. He had acquired the magic of method, which of itself works wonders. His education was very limited outside of mathematics. Probably he did not learn even the simplest rules of grammar in school. We may infer this from his notebooks of that period, in which grammatical mistakes often occur. But even in grammar he made himself a master when once he had fixed his attention upon it. Careful consideration and comparisons, with attentive reading of masterpieces of literature, was a training which enabled him later to express himself in pure and correct language, both in speaking and writing, And the reader will see from examples which we shall give that Washington became a master of style. But study alone could not have made purity, sincerity, and directness the most prominent characteristics of his writings. His literary style was the mirror of his character. He appreciated his good fortune in having family connections which gave him the entree into several cultivated family circles. His brother Lawrence was happily married, living in comfortable circumstances on his estate at Mount Vernon, and George was often there. A few miles away was Belvoir, the large property of Lawrence's father-in-law, the above-mentioned William Fairfax. This man had passed an eventful life. He was born in England, entered the army early, took part in several campaigns, and was later appointed by the English government governor and chief justice of an island of the East Indies. He had now been living in Virginia for several years, where, for a long time, he had been president of the Royal Council of the Colonies. The home of this experienced and kindly man, where there was a number of amiable and well-educated sons and daughters, was also open to George. Having his eyes and ears open for all that was improving, George learned many things at Belvoir. He also became acquainted there with an important and at the same time interesting personage, a nobleman of the same name from England, a cousin of William Fairfax, and therefore, since the marriage of George's stepbrother, a sort of relative of his. This Lord Fairfax was a man nearly 60 years old, over 6 feet tall, gaunt and raw-boned, with light gray eyes, sharp features, and an aquiline nose. In England he had distinguished himself equally in the use of the sword and the pen. Through his marriage he acquired boundless territories, so to speak, in Virginia, the whole region between the Rappahannock and Potomac rivers, which later was found to extend into the Allegheny Mountains. By the desire of Lord Fairfax, his cousin William had hitherto managed the property, and Lord Fairfax had only recently arrived in Virginia to become acquainted for the first time with his truly princely domain. It was a wilderness, but what a wilderness! Let us take the opportunity of saying a word about Virginia. The Allegheny Mountains divide the state into 3 regions. The mountainous and romantic one, with the celebrated Natural Bridge, where Cedar Creek dashes along between perpendicular walls of stone 250 feet below the Rock Arch. That portion farther eastward with the sandy, marshy, flat coast, and the arable, rolling western portion bounded by the Ohio River. In the greater part of it, the soil is truly luxuriant. There is fine grazing for sheep as well as cattle. One sees maples, oaks, plantains, nut and tulip trees, lindens, elms, ash, magnolia, chestnut, cherry, and plum trees overgrown with wild grape and other vines in the beautiful forests, and there is no lack of fish and game. Lord Fairfax had not dreamed that Virginia could be so beautiful, and how delightful the task of reclaiming a section of this virgin soil in the midst of the primeval forest seemed to him. How empty and purposeless the pleasures of the city compared with the delights of life and labor in the cultivation of the wilderness. He was never tired of admiring the estate of his cousin. He no doubt had the same feelings as Chateaubriand under the same circumstances, to which he has given utterance in the following words. What a fascinating mixture of social and natural life reigned there! By the side of a cypress wood, charming residue of the impenetrable wilderness, was a nascent vegetation. Ears of corn trembled in golden waves around the roots of a fallen oak. Full sheaves, daughters of a single summer, stood upon the site of the ancient forest. Thick columns of smoke rose from the burning woods and floated away over the fertile fields, while the plow slowly cut its way through the roots of the ancient trees. Surveyors were carefully staking out the boundaries of the new estate. The wild birds had deserted their nests, the dens of wild beasts were converted into roomy cabins, and every blow of the woodman's axe was a prophecy of the blessings which were soon to rest upon these fields. So the venerable but still vigorous Lord Fairfax resolved to settle down in the neighborhood and never to return to England. For a time he lived at Belvoir on the estate of his cousin. We must not conceal the fact that in spite of his enthusiasm for a planter's life, Lord Fairfax had not forgotten to inquire whether the fox was a native of the American forests. He was passionately fond of fox hunting, and if his question had not received a favorable answer, it is more than likely that his newly awakened love for America would soon have waned. However, foxes were very numerous amongst the forest animals of this region, a circumstance which lent fresh charm to the country. But there was still another consideration. On a fox hunt, one must have at least one companion. But where should he find a horseman who could in some degree compare with the former dashing cavalry officer, especially in this hilly region, covered with thickets which had never been penetrated by a human being? The reader may perhaps, ere this, have had an inkling that our George may have been a most welcome hunting companion for the grizzled lover of the hunt. And it was so. Lord Fairfax kept horses and dogs in the English style, and when the hunting season began, George rode out into the woods with him every morning, and they seldom returned without trophies. The nobleman had seen but a small portion of his extensive Virginia estate. Neither had he any intention of riding through the wilderness to inspect it all, but he determined to have it surveyed, especially as he learned that people had already settled on certain portions of it without having any right to do so. Therefore, he considered it very necessary to have it surveyed, so that in future the relations of settler to proprietor might be regulated according to law. Thus he was anxious to find a capable person to undertake the business. Whoever did so must, besides having a knowledge of the business, be conscientious and reliable, and must possess not a little courage. The matter was thoroughly discussed by Lord Fairfax, William Fairfax, and Lawrence Washington. The latter was able to show calculations and surveys which George had made shortly before this on his own property. The result of the conference was that Lord Fairfax felt perfect security in confiding the survey to our George, who had just completed his 16th year. He had taken it for granted that George would not refuse, and he was not mistaken. It is evident that the commission was very flattering to George, and that the execution of it was calculated to perfect him in his profession. In addition to this, he was to receive a considerable sum of money for the work, which he would have been glad to do for its own sake. His diary tells us that he was to receive a doubloon for every full day's work, which is about $7.50 in our money. He first went home to get his mother's permission to undertake the business. Every ambitious youth will appreciate what his feelings were, how his heart glowed at the thought of telling his mother of this honor which had befallen him, and which was to be, in every way, so profitable. End of Chapter 2. Recording by Andrea Kotzer.
Chapter 3 of George Washington. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cheyenne Arrowsmith. George Washington by Ferdinand Schmidt. Translated by George P. Upton. Chapter 3. 3 Years in the Wilderness. Young Washington was tall and of athletic build, which together with his manner made him seem older than he was. It did not occur to anyone to treat the 16-year-old youth like a boy. His principal qualities were earnestness, decision, candor, and modesty. In the spring of 1748, he set out on his surveying expedition, accompanied by the 22-year-old George, son of William Fairfax, and a Negro, all three on horseback. At that time, the beautiful chain of the Blue Ridge Mountains formed the western boundary of inhabited Virginia. The little party was obliged to traverse these in order to reach the territory which they were to survey. The tops of the mountains were still covered with snow and ice, while spring had already sown the valleys with flowers. They had to ride over rocky passes and through thickets to reach their destination. The greatest difficulty they encountered was in crossing the mountain torrent swollen by the melting snows, but courage and resourcefulness helped them to surmount all obstacles. Crossing a pass, they at last reached the chief valley of Virginia, which is nearly 25 miles broad and very beautiful. The clear river which flows through it was called the Daughter of the Stars by the Indians, because of its loveliness. George outdid himself in glowing descriptions of the region in his diary, but from the moment when real work began, there is not a trace of such descriptions to be found in the book. From that time, he lived only for his work, as it was seldom that the little company chanced upon the hut of a squatter. George and his companions spent most of their nights around a campfire in the forest. Their food consisted, for the most part, of wild turkeys. A fork-shaped stick was the spit, and a chip of wood the plate. Of course, George had to expect and be prepared to meet with Indians, so that he and his companions had armed themselves. It was natural that the Indians should not be very friendly to the settlers. They looked upon the country as their property and upon the white squatters as interlopers and robbers. There was much cruelty practiced on both sides. Fairly considered, one must admit that the Indians had shown themselves incapable of any kind of communal development, and it would have been a pity for such an enormous territory, immensely rich in some portions, to have remained in the sole possession of a race which was incapable of civilization and which probably never numbered over 100,000 people. In contrast to the Indians, the increase of the Europeans was extraordinary. In his own peculiar but essentially just manner, this was once commented upon by an Indian chief called by the Americans Little Turtle, in a speech to the whites. It is a strange and incomprehensible thing about the white people. Scarcely 2 generations have passed since you set foot on our soil, and already you cover it like a swarm of insects, while we aborigines, who have lived here no one knows how long, are almost as few in number as the deer which we hunt. To be sure, you pale-faces know how to make use of a piece not much bigger than my hand. On a patch only 15 or 20 times as great as this room, a white man will raise enough food to keep him for a full year. He takes another bit of land grown with grass and herbs and raises his cattle upon it, which supply him with milk and meat. We red men, on the contrary, need immense territories for the deer which we kill and which scarce provides us with food for 2 days, needs a great region in which to attain its proper growth. And when we have killed 200 or 300 deer, it is the same as though we had destroyed all the grass and woods on which they subsisted. The white man spread out like oil on a blanket, while we melt away like snow in the spring sunshine, and if we do not soon adopt new ways, it will be impossible for the race of red men long to survive. But the Indians showed themselves incapable of learning new ways. George, who had seen no Indians heretofore, met a band of about 30 warriors one day. One of them carried the scalp of an enemy as a pennant in front of the procession. It would have gone hard with the little company if the Indians had attacked them, which would no doubt have happened if they had shown any signs of fear. A small present of liqueur procured them the spectacle of a war dance. The Indians kindled a fire in the midst of an open space and seated themselves in a circle around it. Then the chief began to extol their deeds of valor, his voice and gestures becoming more and more animated. The warriors sat with bowed heads as in a dream. Suddenly, as though awakened by the glowing description of their heroic deeds, a warrior sprang up and began a curious wild dance. One after another followed his example until most of them were leaping about the blazing fire, emitting frightful cries and seeming more like demons than human beings. Music was not lacking for this spectacle. One savage drummed on a deerskin, which was stretched over a kettle half filled with water, and another played upon an instrument made of a hollow gourd, which contained a number of pieces of shot and was decorated with a horse tail. The survey was completed, and in little more than a month's time, George arrived at Mount Vernon, where he gave an account of his work to Lord Fairfax and received the acknowledgment of his complete satisfaction. Young Washington had, with the accomplishment of this piece of work, taken his diploma, so to speak, as a surveyor. His reputation was established, and before he was 17 he received the appointment as public surveyor, and his work, from this time, was officially accepted by the public authorities of Virginia. He received orders from many quarters and for 3 years devoted himself to his growing business. We may know how conscientiously he did his work from the fact that, down to this day, in Virginia, the surveys are relied upon which are officially recorded under his name. Lord Fairfax immediately made arrangements for the cultivation of a beautiful portion of his large property on the other side of the Blue Ridge. He laid out a gentleman's estate of 10,000 acres of pasture and farmlands, which he called Greenway Court. The greater part of the 3 years George spent in the beautiful but lonely forest. What a contrast this is to the enervating life of many youths in our great cities. The grand impressions of nature strengthened and stilled him in body and mind. The solitude of the woods stimulated him to dwell upon the noblest thoughts and emotions. In the intervals of work, he spent more or less time with his step-brother, Lawrence's father-in-law, and Lord Fairfax. Association with these men of fine breeding kept his manners from deteriorating in spite of his life in the wilderness. It is not surprising that he gained confidence in himself through his work, and because of the confidence with which it was accepted by everyone else. And the labor of these 3 years was of still greater advantage to him in another way, which he did not appreciate until later. How could the young surveyor dream that before long he should be traversing the same region as a soldier? It is always most important in the conduct of a war to know the configurations of the country well. As an engineer, Washington had surveyed his future theatre of war and carefully noted down his observations. End of Chapter 3. Recording by Cheyenne Arrowsmith.
Chapter 4 of George Washington. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. George Washington by Ferdinand Schmidt. Translated by George P. Upton. Chapter 4. The Ambassador. That man alone deserves to live who consistently makes a good use of his life. He who does not do so really does not live at all, at least not in a human sense. He who understands life does not bury his talent, but constantly develops his gifts for his own good and that of his fellow men, and such a life is a worthy one. George Washington was now 19 years old, and already his fellow citizens gave him credit for a high degree of manly courage and judgment. This is proved by a circumstance which we are now going to relate. The borders of Virginia were often disturbed by attacks by the French and Indians, so that the colonial government decided to prepare the men capable of bearing arms, or the militia, for defense. Virginia was divided into districts, over each of which an officer with the rank of major and the title of adjutant general was placed. The pay was £150 sterling yearly. This officer was expected to bring the militia of his district up to the highest grade of military efficiency. The high reputation which George Washington had won caused him to be offered such a post. It was thoroughly in accord with the tastes of his earliest youth, as we have already learned. But while accepting it, he appreciated thoroughly all the responsibilities of the position. His first and most earnest care was to make himself master of all the knowledge and duties of his rank. Under the tutelage of his brother and of other officers who had seen active service, he studied the science of war and perfected himself in the use of the sword. Thus he was acquiring a new profession, in which he was to gain honor and fame. Before he had an opportunity, however, of testing his abilities in his new position, he had a painful duty to perform for his beloved brother Lawrence, whose lungs had become so affected that the doctors advised him to seek relief in the milder climate of the West Indies. The sick man wished George to accompany him, and he could not refuse such a request from his dearly beloved brother. They set sail in the fall of 1751, returning in midsummer of the following year. George enriched by new experiences and impressions, but distressed with the fear that his brother would not regain his health. The sick man had also given up hope, and only came back because he wished to die at home. He did die very soon afterward, mourned sincerely by all who had been closely related to him or had had an opportunity of becoming acquainted with his amiable personality. Lawrence left a widow and little daughter. He had given his brother a part of his large fortune and made him executor of his will. The estate of Mount Vernon was to go to his daughter, or, in the event of her death without heirs, to George. The widow was to enjoy the income from his estate for life. As soon as Washington had settled these affairs, he returned to his military duties. Governor Dinwiddie had in the meanwhile divided Virginia into 4 districts, and Washington, now 20 years old, was given charge of one of them. It was his duty to train the officers, as well as the men of his district, in military tactics. There was a particular reason for the new military partition of Virginia by the governor, and for the zeal with which he sought to put the militia on a war footing. A quarrel had broken out between the English and French for the possession of the fertile lands stretching from the Alleghany Mountains to the Ohio River. The English governor, Dinwiddie, took possession of them for England, and the governor of Canada for France. Both sides sought to gain over the Indian tribes that lived on the land or near it, so that on the outbreak of hostilities they might have their assistance. Both parties claimed a right to the Ohio region. It would have been hard to tell where the title really lay, but both sides were determined not to give way, but to let matters come to a crisis. This was why Governor Dinwiddie was so anxious to get the Virginia militia ready for action. The command came from England to erect 2 forts on the Ohio, but while the letter containing this order was crossing the ocean, the French had already taken possession of part of the disputed territory. The English governor now determined to send an emissary to the French commander, to make a last attempt at a peaceable adjustment, as well as to get some knowledge of the strength of the enemy and of his position. The governor found no one so well fitted for this mission as George Washington. It was a difficult piece of work. It meant a journey of not less than 560 miles, principally through a region that was neither quite uninhabited nor peopled by Indian tribes of uncertain temper. An advantage in the negotiations was only to be gained by conducting them with the utmost circumspection and courage. Washington did not refuse the office which the governor had offered him, although he clearly recognized the difficulties of the mission. He immediately prepared for the eventful journey. As companions he had, besides his fencing master, an interpreter and 4 frontiersmen, of whom 2 were Indian traders. The journey was begun during the raw November days of 1753. The progress of the little company was much impeded by storms and snow. They had to ford streams and cross rivers on quickly improvised rafts. As they were nearing their goal, they met with Indians who were friendly to the English. One chief told them that he had explained to the French commander in a speech that the French had no right to take possession of the land. Of course, the chief had not written his discourse, but he had preserved it word for word in his memory, and could repeat it for Washington, who had the interpreter translate it for him, and he wrote it all down in his diary. As the speech is a very characteristic one, we shall give a part of it here. Remember that it was addressed to the French commander. "Fathers," said he, "you are disturbers of this land by building towns and taking it from us by fraud or force. We kindled a fire long ago at Montreal, where we desired you to stay, and not to come and intrude upon our country. I now advise you to return thither, for this land is ours. If you had come in a peaceable manner, like our brothers the English, we should have traded with you as we do with them. But that you should come and take our possessions by force, and build houses upon them, is what we cannot submit to. Both you and the English are white. We live in a region between you both. The land belongs to neither of you. The Great Spirit allotted it to us as a home. So I desire you, as I have desired our brothers, the English, to withdraw, for I will keep you both at arm's length. Whoever most regards this request, by them we will stand, and consider them friends. Our brothers, the English, have heard this, and I now come to tell it to you." The Indian chief told them, however, that the French had won over several Indian tribes completely. After a few days Washington set out once more. The exceedingly difficult and dangerous journey to the headquarters of the French commander in the northern Ohio country lasted just 1 day less than 6 weeks. The Frenchman received Major Washington politely, but when the purpose of the mission was explained to him, refused any discussion of the disputed question, for he claimed that, as a soldier, his sole duty was to carry out the orders of his government. Thereupon, Washington took all the more pains to fulfill the second part of his task, and to obtain the most exact information possible relative to the strength of the French garrison and the situation of the fortifications. When he had informed himself sufficiently on these points, he started for home. The return was also very dangerous and toilsome. Several times the little company was ambushed by Indians who were friendly to the French, and for weeks they encamped on the snowy ground. Once Washington came near being drowned in a rushing stream. He notes this in his diary thus: "There was no way for getting over but on a raft, which we set about with but one poor hatchet, and finished just after sunsetting. This was a whole day's work. We next got it launched, then went on board of it and set off. But before we were halfway over, we were jammed in the ice in such a manner that we expected every moment our raft would sink and ourselves perish. I put out my setting pole to try to stop the raft, that the ice might pass by, when the rapidity of the stream threw it with so much violence against the pole that it jerked me out into 10 feet of water. But I fortunately saved myself by catching hold of one of the raft logs. Notwithstanding all our efforts, we could not get to either shore, but were obliged, as we were near an island, to quit our raft and make to it." After such an adventure, think of the night on a desert island! And they could not even expect succor in the morning. But the unexpected happened. Cakes of ice piled up on one side of the island in such a way that they were able to gain the shore. In the middle of January, 1754, Washington reached home, and the next day made his report to the governor. End of chapter 4.
Chapter 5 of George Washington. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Mack, Tucson, Arizona. George Washington by Ferdinand Schmidt. Translated by George P. Upton. Washington's First Battles. It was now clear to the governor that the French were determined to defend what they called their right to the disputed territory. Therefore, he considered it wise to proceed against them without delay. He believed that procrastination would only benefit the enemy by giving them time to strengthen their position. Accordingly, he called the Assembly of Virginia together, laid his plan before it, and urged its speedy execution. The Burgesses, however, met his demands at first with great coldness. It was said that the rights of the mother country, England, to the Ohio region were in any case of a very doubtful nature. If, however, the King of England wished to support his claims to it, he should send over soldiers from England. Finally, however, they agreed to grant £10,000 for the enlistment of troops. Washington had shown himself so capable in every respect in carrying out the mission which had been entrusted to him that the governor did not hesitate to offer him the chief responsibility of the troops, but he declined the honor as, quote, the responsibility was too great for his youth and inexperience, end quote. The governor then appointed the English Colonel Joshua Fry, an intelligent and experienced officer, commander-in-chief, and Washington was persuaded to accept the second command with the title of lieutenant colonel. They immediately set out on their march, Washington leading the vanguard, which consisted of only 3 companies. On the Ohio frontier, he had an opportunity to strike the first blow by attacking a French scouting party which had come out to pick him off. Only 1 Frenchman saved himself by flight. The rest were either killed or taken prisoners. Indians took part in this skirmish against the French. A letter which Washington sent a few days later to the governor shows what an ardent soldier he was. Quote, your honor may depend I will not be surprised. Let them come at what hour they will, and this is as much as I can promise. But my best endeavors shall not be wanting to effect more. I doubt not you may hear I am beaten, but you will hear at the same time that we have done our duty in fighting, as long as there is a shadow of hope. Close quote. At this time, Fry suddenly died, and the governor again invited Washington to take command of the troops. This time, elated by his recent victory, he did not refuse the call. The march was resumed under great difficulties. He was joined by a great many Indian families who proved themselves useful as scouts, but they were not to be counted on during an engagement. It turned out later that some of these savages were sent into his camp as spies by the French. The march now took him through a mountainous region. The horses were worn out, and there were so few of them that the men were obliged not only to carry heavy burdens, but also to take turns in dragging the field pieces. The commander encouraged officers and men by word and example. He loaded his horse with baggage and went afoot himself. After a march of several days, they reached an old encampment where some entrenchments had been thrown up. The men were thoroughly exhausted. It had been raining incessantly for several days, and for a whole week there had been no bread. Washington resolved, therefore, to rest for a few days in this spot and await the arrival of expected provisions. Here they were suddenly attacked by an overwhelming number of the French. It was at an early hour in the morning when the enemy fired upon them. Washington, who was prepared, had his troops march out to the plain. The French, however, continued firing from ambush, and it was soon evident that, in spite of their superior numbers, they did not intend to give up their favorable position, but that their object was rather to entice their foes into the forest. But Washington avoided this, fell back into his entrenchments, and ordered his troops to be very careful of their ammunition and to fire only when there was some chance of success. The French, who had Indian warriors in their service, were posted on a thickly wooded height, from whence they kept up a sharp fire all day. It rained without intermission, the trenches filled with water, and the muskets became more and more useless. Toward evening, the French called out that they wanted to parley, but as Washington believed the enemy was only anxious to spy out his camp, he paid no attention to the demand. After a while, another message came from the French, adding that they did not wish to enter the camp and asking that an officer should be sent to them, for whose safety they pledged their honor. Washington consented to this, and the result of the conference, which now took place, was that Washington agreed to an honorable capitulation. By his firmness and valiant resistance, he had succeeded in concealing his real situation, which had become desperate. Because the provision wagons had remained so far behind that the troops were entirely without food, and the ammunition was very nearly exhausted. If the French had been informed of the miserable condition of the entrenchments, for the restoration of which nothing could be done, they never would have agreed to such a capitulation, and if the battle had been continued, Washington and his troops would probably have been doomed to destruction. The next morning he left the entrenchments with military honors, and they were at once occupied by the French. Washington had done the best which could be done under the circumstances, for which he and his soldiers received the acknowledgment of the governor and the House of Burgesses. Washington had one serious obstacle to contend with during the whole campaign. The militia was receiving less pay than the British soldiers. He now took up this subject anew. The continuance of the rule was evidently equivalent to contempt for the Virginia militia, which had, it was admitted, fought heroically. As his demands were not acceded to, and in regard to several other regulations he was not in accord with the governor, he demanded his dismissal. But his retirement did not last long. The following year, 2 well-equipped British regiments, under command of General Braddock, landed, and Washington was persuaded to join the new commander. He expressed himself with noble candor to a friend on his reasons for this step. Quote, "I do not think I should be blamed if I believe that I deserve some praise, considering that my only object in taking part in this campaign is the commendable wish to serve my country. Neither ambition nor desire of gain move me to this step. I hope that this is clearly shown by my going as a volunteer with no expectation of pay or any hope of receiving a command, as I am firmly convinced that General Braddock is not at liberty to give me any post which I would accept." End quote. The march to the Ohio was immediately commenced, and there certainly would have been important results achieved if only the valiant British general had been more willing to listen to good advice. In haughty security, he moved his battalions forward, led by the music of the military bands, as though he were on a parade ground. Sending out scouts seemed to him a measure denoting cowardice and not caution. He was therefore soon surrounded by swarms of Indian foes, and very soon the enemy knew the strength and destination of the company. It was on the 9th of June when the British fell into an ambuscade, where a terrific fire poured in on them from the French and Indians, who had taken up sheltered positions. A greater part of the soldiers of the vanguard fell, among them 26 officers. A still greater number were wounded, and General Braddock paid for this with foolhardy rashness with his life. It was almost a miracle that Washington was saved. As long as Braddock was alive, Washington went dashing to and fro with orders from one threatened point to another. When the commander had fallen, he sought the most dangerous places, trying to save the day, and many of the enemy recognized him as a dangerous foe who knew how to inspire his men to renewed ardor by admonition and example. A number of Indians who had for some time been directing a well-aimed fire at him finally desisted when the fruitlessness of their efforts led them to believe that the Great Spirit had taken the man under his protection. A chieftain told this afterward. Washington himself believed that God had protected him, for he wrote to a friend, quote, "But by the all-powerful dispensations of Providence, I have been protected beyond all human probability or expectation, for I had 4 bullets through my coat and 2 horses shot under me, and yet escaped unhurt, though death was leveling my companions on every side of me." End quote. It was owing to his courage and coolness that at least a part of the army was saved. Throughout the country there was but one opinion of Washington's ability. A preacher delivered the following eulogy from the pulpit, quote, "As one who has distinguished himself on this occasion, I must mention that heroic youth, Colonel Washington, whom I cannot hope Providence has hitherto preserved in so signal a manner for some important service to his country." End quote. Washington retired to Mount Vernon, which he had in the meanwhile inherited through the death of his brother's daughter. But he retained the post of adjutant general and tried, by appropriate drilling and ordinances, to prepare the militia under him for efficiency in active service. The defeat of Braddock had frightened the Virginians out of their indifference, and it was recognized that money and troops must not be spared if the constantly increasing menace of war was to be suppressed. Everyone wished to entrust Washington with the chief command. As the reader has already learned, his mother was not one of those timid creatures who shrink from every breath of danger and extinguish every spark of courage in the breast of their sons. Still, the lively picture of dangers with which her son had been threatened in the last battle moved her to beg him with tears to give up military service forever. He sought tenderly to reassure her by speaking of God, who is master of life and death, and he added, quote, "If the command is pressed upon me by the general voice of the country, and offered upon such terms as cannot be objected to, it would reflect dishonor on me to refuse it, and that I am sure must and ought to give you greater uneasiness than my going in an honorable command." End quote. But he was not willing to undertake such an exceedingly difficult post as that of commander-in-chief without making conditions. With clear insight into the requirements of the situation, he demanded that the commander-in-chief have a voice in the choice of his officers, punctual payment of their salaries, and a complete revision of all the commissary department according to principles proposed by him. All this was granted and soon proved advantageous to the war footing of the army. Later, he introduced another law into the House of Burgesses, which gave the military courts the right to punish murderers and deserters, and by which even gaming, drinking, cursing, and loose life were to be appropriately punished. It took a determined man like Washington not only to have those laws passed, but to enforce them. One of the principal tasks of his campaign was to drive the French out of Fort Duquesne in Ohio, and in this he succeeded. Thereby the power of the French on the Ohio was destroyed, and for the last and most difficult part of the task, which had occupied him for several years and so extraordinarily employed his faculties, was finished. The Indian tribes that had been on the French side now came over to the victors and made overtures of peace, which were accepted. When Washington had accomplished this honorable task, he laid down his command and retired to private life. End of chapter 5. Recording by Tom Mack. Tucson, Arizona.